Hi, so I was hoping to talk today about some opportunities that we see in machine learning, and specifically two concepts related to these. If I can get the prompter working, I'll use the computer. One is the Barbell effect of machine learning, and I wrote an epically long blog for those who are having trouble sleeping on this subject, but I can summarize it in a couple slides here. And also on how to create a sustainable data advantage, which I think is the essence of significant enterprise value creation in machine learning. So 2016 was a humbling year for humanity. As you know, AlphaGo defeated Lee Sedol in Go. Microsoft, after decades of trying, finally achieved speech recognition parity with humans. And Tesla demonstrated a lower fatality rate than human drivers. Interestingly, also Google announced one of the coolest new machine learning apps that I've seen, which identifies locations from images alone. And as you all know, what's driven these innovations is the machine learning revolution, which started really to reach its first tipping points in the mid-90s with gaming skills in defeating humans in video games, chess and Go, and then mechanical skills, robotic movements, autonomous driving, and slowly has moved up the stack. There was a big tipping point on perception, and particularly image recognition in 2012 with Google's CatNet. I think today we're in the midst of a tipping point in NLP and basic cognition. The next step on this pyramid is pretty clear. I think logic, first and second level logic, will likely be coming soon through machine learning. And beyond that, it's a fascinating mystery. And if people here have a better understanding of this is one of the most fascinating questions I find in the field. I think it's natural to impose an anthropomorphic lens on this pyramid and think, well, we must be at the top. And I think Alan Turing actually created some cognitive dissonance in the computer science field by suggesting that the Turing test was sort of the ultimate test of intelligence in a computer. Pedro Dominguez recently said the Turing test felt to him like saying a plane doesn't count as a plane unless it can convince a bird that it's a bird. And I think he's probably right. And just as humans discovered that the Earth was not the center of the universe, I think most machine learning researchers believe that human intelligence and perhaps consciousness more generally are just interesting suburbs on the broader intelligence spectrum. So there's one insight that's helpful in thinking about how to create great businesses in machine learning, and particularly machine learning at this phase, which tends to be very deep learning heavy. It's the data trumps algorithms. As you guys know, most of the workhorse algorithms for machine learning are in the public domain. And this is a speech recognition experiment, and you can see the performance of the 4 different learning algorithms vary relatively slightly to each other compared to how much better they all perform with more data. And as Peter Norvig said, at Google, we don't have better algorithms, we just have more data. And that leads to a really interesting dynamic, an observation, a dynamic in competition in machine learning, which is that if software is egalitarian, machine learning is feudal. And the reason is that 2 of the 3 components of machine learning, computing power and algorithms, are widely available commodities. Data, on the other hand, has highly concentrated ownership, with the result that there's a tendency for natural monopoly around unique data sets. And I think at this particular phase in machine learning, we can say that the biggest winners for the foreseeable future will likely be the big platforms, the big consumer platforms that have the most data, Google and Amazon and Facebook and so on. It's always difficult and humbling to try to predict the future. So let's see where we are in 3 or 4 years. And this leads to an interesting sort of feudal structure of the current environment that I tried to summarize with the title, The Barbell Effect of Machine Learning. If I were to try to characterize the impact that machine learning is going to have on the broader technology environment, I think it's going to have a very big impact in 2 places. The first place is, and it will depend, those 2 places depend on how much data the different players have. At the high end of the data spectrum, I think it's going to lead to a significant concentration of higher order intelligence and really an entrenchment of monopolies in that area. And at the lower end, I think there's going to be all sorts of new tools, basic semantic and analytic services that will serve as new building blocks for startups and create a sort of democratization of basic intelligence. So at the top of the barbell are all the major platforms. I think China is the other major country where really significant data scale has been reached. And I think the capabilities that these organizations will have certainly relate to their core competence optimization. As I think you all know, and I think this is fascinating, Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Netflix all run their core competences on machine learning, which is a huge jump from where we were 3 years ago. So search for Google, the news feed for Facebook, pricing for Amazon, and recommendations for Netflix were all driven by machine learning. They'll be able to predict their users' and customers' behavior and therefore maximize profits more effectively. And periodically, and this is, I think, one of the coolest aspects of the field, they'll develop these orthogonal superpowers, like Google being able to recognize the location of a photo just by the pixels in the photo and not by any geolocation stamp. At the bottom of the barbell are the rest of us, consumers, enterprises, other technology vendors. There will be a significant benefit for us as well, I think, in these commodity capabilities that will typically be in the form of APIs that we can plug into our applications for things like image recognition and speech recognition, translation, and so on. And these will be offered, currently they're being offered by a subset of the platform companies who deliver these services, and generally for free. I think almost all will be free or exceptionally cheap in exchange for our data, and that's the feudal social contract. It does serve everybody reasonably well, but it reinforces the monopoly of the platforms. So what does the machine learning revolution mean for startups? I was impressed at the number of startups at the conference, and this is where I spend all my time. And I think in essence it means the creation of new building blocks for startups. And the building blocks available to different startups depend on how much data you have. So at the bottom, you'll get these commodity API services from the platforms, and those will be great. They'll lead to the development of lots of new applications. Further up the stack, when you have more data as a startup, you can make use of optimization engines, sort of best fit prediction engines, primarily for the optimization of applications, sometimes for the development of new applications. If you really have a lot of data, you may be able to develop a fundamentally new machine learning capability. One of the companies that I've invested in is called Data Miner, and they've partnered with Twitter, and I'll talk about them a little bit more later. And they're the one company that has access to the full real-time Twitter fire hose, and they did something with that data. They started as an API partner that nobody thought, that Twitter didn't even think was possible, but it was so cool once they discovered it. Twitter said, we'd love to help you, we'd love to invest and create a broader partnership. And we came up with this term inevitably just before the press release and the financing when we had to call it something. Those tend to be the best investments where there's not yet a name for it. It's a signal that you're onto something new. They effectively identify the emerging digital signatures of events as they're starting to happen. So in today's world, events of any significance, even micro-significance, leave digital signatures, and Twitter catches a lot of them. Data Miner has access to 64 plus data sets. Twitter's the biggest one. And in the first milliseconds of the emergence of that signature, they can determine what the event was, how significant it was, and to whom it's relevant. So for example, they identified the assassination of bin Laden 28 minutes before Bloomberg and the New York Times, which was pretty cool. And it wasn't well wrapped. They inferred it from seeing different pieces of the elephant. And they're now the standard wire service. The top 200 news organizations in the world use them as the primary source for their own news. It's just a fascinating shift in the world where human beings, we're all information sensors with an S, and we all have an ability to take photos, to record events near us. And if you can sort through those with machine learning, you can develop a new capability. So I am particularly attracted to this top row here, companies that can develop new capabilities. Tesla and autonomous driving, obviously another example. And I think there'll be many more to come. And I think if I were to take a guess at the companies that will be the most valuable that are created this year, next year, the following year, they will fall into that top category. So if there's one axiom, so if anyone here is in the process of doing this or planning to do this, I think the one axiom that I think is helpful in thinking about how do you do this effectively and how do you win is building a sustainable data advantage. I think this is the primary foundation of value creation in machine learning, and And there are multiple parts to it. I should say first that there are kind of two ways to create a sustainable data advantage. One is to create a really cool new company that has nothing to do with machine learning but generates a lot of data, like the companies in the top row, and then apply machine learning to it to optimize those capabilities, or as in the case of Tesla, to develop new capabilities like autonomous driving. I think most of you know that Tesla was not thinking at all about autonomous driving when it started. It wanted to create a really cool and the world's best electric car, and it did that. And once it started to grow very rapidly, it had a capability, it had a platform to put far more sensors to be able to drive the intelligence for autonomous driving much more effectively than anyone else, and successfully took advantage of that. The second way is through a one-step business model, to have machine learning be part of the core value proposition and aim for that sustainable data advantage from the start. I think now that startups and large companies know the machine learning game, recognize the power of this new technology, the new artificial intelligence companies to watch fall into the second category, but there'll always be big new companies that are created, and once they're at scale, think, wow, we should really do something with machine learning to optimize our competences. So what do you need in order to do that, to build a sustainable data advantage? Obviously, you have to have a lot of data to enable the use of machine learning. And obviously, if it's an advantage, you've got to have a relative advantage in the scale of that data. And as goes without saying, this has to be very high-quality data. So those two are pretty straightforward. The hardest one, I think, is the third one, privileged access. How can you, as a startup, it is damn hard to get privileged access to any data. It's hard to develop your own data at any real scale to do machine learning. So how do you do that? I think there have been three historical ways, and I'll talk a little bit about which of these we see the most promising going forward. You can aggregate others' data. You can partner with data owners, which is the way Data got started. Interesting, the way Citrix got started, the way Bloomberg got started. Or you can create your own data. And each of these map to certain business models. So if we start with aggregating your own data, this maps to most of the great internet business models. When there was a wide open field on the internet and content was all fresh and unaggregated, those big platforms managed to aggregate lots of data and effectively make it their own. For anyone who's looked carefully at their rights to their data for what they post on Facebook, what they post on Twitter, what they sell on Amazon, you've basically given most of it away. They basically own your data in all but name. There's one other interesting sort of niche-y business model that I think is super cool. If anyone has any plans to start one of these, let me know, because when they work, they're terrifically interesting, which are data co-ops, which sounds sort of socialist. They kind of are, but it's really cool, where a group of companies get together, pool their data for collective advantage. So there's a company called Verisk that has done this and is I think it's like a $19 billion company today in the insurance industry, where it was very helpful for insurance companies to be able to look at an anonymous pool and how they stacked up to it when it came to understanding risk. Those require a certain amount of diplomacy and leadership to pull off, but very, very interesting when they work. Partnering with data owners is a new area that I think is, or newer, that I think will accelerate with the advent of machine learning. For creating your own data, the primary business models that map to this method of aggregating data or getting privileged access to data are full stack products like Tesla, meaning they're not providing technology to a company in that industry. They're taking advantage of the entire stack, building the entire stack as a product, so a car. And what's interesting about full stack products or full stack services, and you can think of Netflix or Uber as full stack services, is in virtue of owning so much of the stack, they have an ability to capture a lot of data. So Tesla could not be where it is today if it was selling little sensors to GM and getting data that way. They have to own the whole car. They have to be able to refit it with their own sensors and get lots of different readings on it. So I'll talk a little bit about full stack product and service business models. And the last business model is federated applications. So these are enterprise applications where, as a company, you pull the data from and combine the data for multiple enterprises to power your intelligence. So let's dig into each of these just a little bit more, because this is really, I think, the crux of how you can get a jump start as a startup. So aggregating others' data was a great game in the mid-90s, in the late 90s. It's really difficult now because the large consumer platforms dominate so much of the consumer landscape. If you were to try to launch a new mobile app, there are 2,000 launched today. It's just hard. It's hard to get attention in the App Store. It's hard to get a lot of users and engagement. There's a battle for attention. And then if you were to try to market it through different channels, you'll find that those channels are deeply controlled by platforms who may even have competitive products. So there are always unexpected consumer successes, and there always will be. And they're hard to predict. They're hard to plan. If you're a data scientist and you'd like to do a consumer company, maybe you'll have the idea for the next Snap, but often these things are random and they apply machine learning later and fall more into the two-step business model. Enterprise data is very difficult to aggregate. It's a great idea to say to a lot of enterprises, hey, let's just pull all your data from all your Salesforce applications and we'll pull them together and do something cool on them. Salesforce is not wild about that. It's hard to get businesses to do it. There are challenging rights issues with a lot of the data. It's much more effective when you have those rights from the start, given the nature of your application. FICO is an interesting example. A very old company, now uses a lot of machine learning, where it pools, it has an element of a data co-op, but it's really in the form of an application, pulls data from lots of different companies to measure credit risk and pool that data to measure credit risk. Interestingly similar to Verisk. If we look at the second way of getting privileged access, partnering with data owners, these are infrequent, but they're super cool when they work. Data Miner's been a really interesting instance of success. Citrix, as many of you will remember, got the source code, partnered with Microsoft for its source code, developed a suite of applications around that, had very close diplomatic relationships, go-to-market relationships with Microsoft, and the mutual independence benefited both, and they made the partnership work, and Citrix became a very successful company. Risk metrics, you often see these in the financial world because they're very data-intensive businesses, and large investment banks in particular, like JP Morgan, spin out a lot of companies. Risk metrics was spun out of JP Morgan. And it was in the days before machine learning, but it effectively provided a risk model based on the data they had aggregated. JP Morgan became a big shareholder, and it went public and ultimately was acquired for $2.5 billion. My guess is that we'll see a lot more of these. And the reason is there are all these great data sets to develop all these interesting new capabilities and extract intelligence from, but they're locked up in companies that aren't likely to do it themselves or will need help to do it themselves. And I actually think with data as a new currency, there will be a lot of creative new partnerships that are created. There's one other company I've invested in, several other that I'm looking at that are in the midst of these negotiations with big data owners. And so I'm seeing the beginning of a wave. I think these are really challenging to negotiate and structure in the right way. Things can go wrong if the large data partner says, hey, we don't want to do this, we want to do this ourselves. So it's very helpful to think through what the effective social contract is to make them work. One observation that I've had for anyone thinking of starting one of these is that as a startup, you've got to be able to offer not just orthogonal value, which is to say, hey, we can make money using your data in lots of other markets, let us do it, it'll be great, you'll make money. If you just did that, they'd probably say, okay, but then when the next company comes along and says, we can do all of that, but for a lower price or less equity, they'll probably do that. If you offer strategic value, then you effectively become you enter into a deep symbiosis with that company. So, if you look at the Data Miner Twitter partnership, Twitter asked Data Miner to do something that was very important to them, which is it recognized the value of real-time information on its platform and recognized that Data Miner had a unique ability to identify these early on. And it said, could you use your capability and create a news product for news organizations, media organizations are always asking us to help them find breaking information. We know when things are trending, but you see them in their first milliseconds. And Data Miner said, sure, we'll do that. And so they built this news product that's now sort of the dominant digital news agency. And as a result, the two organizations have a deep symbiosis, and that's helped the partnership immensely. And the third way of getting privileged access to data is to create one's own. This is also extremely difficult as a startup. Generally, you don't create sufficient pools of data quickly enough to use machine learning as a startup for some time. But I think this is really the best way because you have control over your destiny. And I think there'll be more and more of these opportunities because data is becoming more visual. Data is entering all these other fields of intelligence besides just text where it was historically, such that a new company can create a lot of data that's capable of being used for machine learning, like a visual data set. Like if you are a drone company and you're scanning crops, very quickly you can get enough data to say, okay, here's how your crops are doing, here's how they compare to competitors' crops. And so the advent of visual intelligence has created an opportunity for startups. I think the biggest opportunity in creating one's own data is in federated applications. I think we've seen a lot of machine learning in the consumer world, and it's just starting in the enterprise world. And the most sophisticated enterprise are using machine learning internally. There are new applications being developed. I would bet there are going to be multiple $5, $10 billion companies built in the federated application space. So creating a data advantage isn't enough. You also have to be able to sustain it. And so how do you do that? You really, the only sustainable way to do that is to earn it with learning loops. By investing in the learning to make your product more valuable, to enable you to get more customers, and thereby get more data, and get into the type of virtuous cycle that Google has gotten into with its search engine, Tesla has gotten into with autonomous vehicles. What's interesting is, if you just look at this in pure economic terms, the greatest value creation in machine learning comes not so much from the machine learning capabilities themselves, but from the learning loops that build around them. Because these learning loops enable the leaders to race ahead at a much faster level of innovation. And interestingly, it sort of automates much of that innovation. I mentioned earlier that Google, Netflix, Amazon, and Facebook have put a lot of their core competences on machine learning. This has enabled them to rocket ahead. So for anyone thinking of starting a search engine, 5, 10 years ago was probably too late. It's definitely too late now. There's no way you'll be able to catch up. So an interesting example of this, as I mentioned, is Tesla. If you look in the upper right, Tesla got a lot of cars on the road very quickly and was able to aggregate more data than others. It outfitted its Model S vehicles with a much broader set of sensors, pictured on the upper left, and that enabled it to get into this virtuous learning loop of getting more customers, more data, better learning, new services, and autonomous driving effectively came about through this type of learning loop and has enabled the company to perform very well. So I probably look at 10 plus AI startups a day, and I'm very excited about the field, but there are some things that I'm skeptical about, and just one person's opinion for what it's worth. But I'm skeptical about two of the primary business models that have arisen in the AI space when there's no sustainable data advantage to go along with them. So the world over the last 18 months went through a crazy bot craze, and Facebook fueled it, a lot of people fueled it. But the fact is, if you don't have the intelligence of the bots built on some really significant data set that is going to enable them to understand how to react, if it's effectively just quick learning conversational intelligence, like a chess-playing computer program that any one of us could write, it's not going to last very long. However, over time, companies that build enterprise apps that get access to lots and lots of customer behavior data and are able to really intelligently build a bot to respond to humans in ways that it knows they will react positively to, I think bots will absolutely be intelligent bots part of the landscape going forward. AI as a service is an interesting area. It's a fraught area in my mind, and the primary reason it's fraught is that it is often in the development path of major platforms. So if you build an image recognition company for everyday objects, chances are Google will totally crush you because they have a lot more data. That's not a good place to compete. There's no way you can get a sustainable data advantage. If, on the other hand, you're looking for different forms of melanoma and you have access to the 3 largest hospital data sets in the field, and they've partnered with you to help create this service to identify melanoma and identify new kinds of melanoma, that's a much more interesting business proposition. So just wanted to, at the end here, mention a few areas that I find particularly interesting going forward. The first is visual intelligence. I think visual intelligence is going through a major explosion right now due to two things. One is a revolution in image processing, which we see in our iPhones and our Android devices. Every year they get better and better and better. And that's been occurring in parallel with the application of deep learning to computer vision to enable much better image recognition and image tracking than has ever been possible. And this is now progressing at the rate of deep learning, and it's getting better and better every year. So on the right, I've listed some industries that are driven by visual intelligence. To robotics and drones, and these benefit also from improvements in sort of iterative learning as a separate field of machine learning. But just in computer vision, their ability to robots to calibrate their motions for things like pick, pack, and handle in warehouses, for drones to fly autonomously, to do precision tracking, capabilities are much greater today than they've ever been. And so I see big opportunity in both of those industries. Agriculture, manufacturing, defense, and security are industries where if you can understand what a computer sees and you can pull the intelligence from that, you can react much more effectively and much more quickly. So I've listed some new application areas that I think are promising in all of those areas as well. I talked a little bit earlier about federated applications. If I were to put my money on one area that I think will generate the largest new companies in machine learning, this is it. These are enterprise applications that are able to take advantage of the collective data of their customers to power their intelligence. I think the two critical factors that one needs to look for or make sure are there if you're thinking of starting a business in this area are one, the ability to create large new data sets. It's seductive to go into an enterprise and say, hey, we'll integrate all your existing data and we'll do some cool machine learning on it. As I said earlier, that's really hard to do. It's hard to pull the data out technically. It's hard to get rights to it. But if you can create an application like Slack that creates massive amounts of new data, that's really interesting. If furthermore, it's in a non-competitive area, so I'm not sharing my online conversion rates and loading that up to your cloud so you can combine it with my competitors' data, which would probably make me highly nervous. But instead, Slack just wants to understand how Slack is being used internally for product improvements. It doesn't matter to me. In fact, I prefer that other companies would be able to pool their data so the application could grow faster. So here I've listed 3 business processes that I would put in that sort of non-competitive zone. And and this is sort of a subset of federated applications that I thought was particularly interesting. And it's where the revolution in consumer communications with the rise of messaging, with the rise of social networking, better speech recognition, better natural language processing, a revolution that we see in our consumer devices all the time from our iPhones, Android devices, Alexa, and so on, that has started to penetrate the enterprise. Slack's a great example. As it touches these different business processes, it creates opportunities for new applications. And because communication applications, by their nature, generate lots and lots and lots of data, it creates these big new data sets. And those data sets are capable of these types of learning loops that drive machine intelligence. And so just to look at these 3 areas, in messaging, in employee communications, we all know that Slack has taken off and done extremely well. In the customer service area, there's an increasing desire of consumers not to resort to email or phone calls to get in touch with companies about problems they're having or questions they have, but to use messaging, because that's the most popular form of communication generally and absolutely for people under 40. There's an interesting company called Quick that we've invested in that's offering a messaging platform for customer service. And in virtue of seeing the intelligence from all the messages, it's able to better inform companies how to route those messages and how best to respond to them. And then finally, in human resources, there are a number of new applications. Some use messaging, some use voice, that are designed to help employees interact with their HR services, so you don't have to go to this awful website of an awful third-party vendor, try to find out what happened to your pay stub for the last 2 months. You can just query it very quickly and get a response back. So Again, I work with startups all day, and so these thoughts I think are primarily directed to people who are thinking about potentially starting companies or who have started companies, but it's also, I think, interesting for those who are observing this rise of new machine learning, this set of machine learning companies. So my words of advice for anyone thinking of starting a company in this area is first, look for a really data-rich application and look in an industry that is obscure. I'm a big believer in blue ocean successes, meaning it's much better to swim in the blue ocean where there aren't sharks than in the red ocean where there are lots of sharks and you're likely to get eaten quickly. So find some interesting corner of agriculture that nobody else is serving, serve it really well, figure out a great solution for them, and establish some credibility and scale before anyone recognizes how well you're doing. And again, it's important that the application be data rich. Two, find a way to create a sustainable data advantage. Really, you can likely create a good business if you don't have a sustainable data advantage, but if you do, it can be an extraordinarily good business given the nature of machine learning. And we talked a bit about the different ways of doing that. As always, to improve your intelligence as you go along, great to network other data sets. That's really hard. It takes a lot of time and practice, but it provides really significant competitive moats. My advice, after doing this for 15 years and getting a few scars from it, stay under the radar and avoid publicity until you really find that sustainable data advantage. There's no shortage of blogs and people who want to sing to the hills about some cool new startup. I really think much of that ends up not doing much favors to the startup because it often attracts a lot of competition. Certainly, once you have something working in a sustainable lead, publicity can help, but I think keeping it quiet until then is generally a good idea. And then invest heavily in learning loops, because if you don't, someone else will. If Google, when there were 7 other search engines besides Google, Google started to use machine learning much earlier than the others, and it made its product better and better and better and better. It actually followed a version of one of the strategies we talked about earlier in that it partnered with AOL and Yahoo, who had the best data sets on the planet for developing the specific capability of search relevance. And so it sort of pulled out, and I think these were in the days where those partners didn't really know that Google was sort of sucking out all the intelligence from them to improve its application. It got better faster, much faster than any of the other search engines. So if you don't invest in those learning loops early, if you're onto a good space, but don't invest in those learning loops, someone else may come along and do it for you. So that's me. If you've got your big new startup idea and you're interested to chat, feel free to reach out anytime. And I will defer to the MC to see if we have time for questions or if we've used it all up. How many? 10 minutes. Okay. Any questions? Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. I think in a lot of fields, standards enable an industry to adopt a particular technology en masse, and they result in the rapid growth of that technology. In machine learning, I think it's a little bit the opposite. The ideal thing is to become the standard. If a standard if everybody can use it, and if everybody has access to the same underlying data, maybe related to it, it may be difficult to develop a real advantage. But I think if you look at the companies that have done well in this area, from a business perspective, in terms of creating business value, I think they've generally created standards where there weren't any, or they've become the standard effectively. I do think there are deeper issues in the machine learning world about standards that everyone should adopt for machine learning. There are interesting ethical questions that come up. There are and huge new initiatives to make sure that were developing AI in the right way. I was talking to one of the top machine learning people at Google, and I asked him, was he as worried as Elon Musk about all of these, Skynet futures that have scared a lot of people reading the paper? And he said, kind of. He said, we've run some simulations, and he said there was this one simulation where a computer was tasked with keeping a room clean, and it locked the owner out, and then the other one thought it should shoot the owner because that's the best way to keep the room clean. And perhaps, but the absence of moral sensibilities can lead, and particularly in things like autonomous weapon systems, can be very dangerous. In fact, autonomous weapon systems are an area where there's a lot of debate about ideally not allowing them to develop because they can learn and evolve and could be very dangerous. So I think ethical standards will be very important in the field. But from a value creation perspective, I think doing what Tesla did, doing what these other companies have done, and racing way ahead of others, aggregating data before the world has time to react, is the way that you build the most company value. Yeah?
For the co-op approach to building large data sets, I've seen companies in healthcare where it works because hospitals don't really have competitive domains to overlap. Are there any other examples beyond that you can think of where that model is really works, and what were the incentives there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll give you two examples. One is just a classical example, really a sort of a legacy example that could be easily machine learning enabled. So I'm a refugee of McKinsey. A long time ago in my idealistic, uneducated youth, ill-educated youth, I worked in a consulting firm. And one of the typical types of projects they would do is get a lot of companies in a given industry together and say, hey, contribute all your data. We can show you how each of you is doing relative to the others, but maintain the anonymity. And they were a trusted party, and those generally worked very well. So I think some sort of performance analytics for an industry could be, I actually think that could be very interesting. The difficult art there is being able to get to the decision makers and not get stuck in, with the people who are in charge of the data. There's another example I saw of a company recently that was doing a data co-op for mobile location data, and it was partnering with lots of mobile apps and basically saying to them, give us your location data, all anonymized, so no privacy concerns, and we'll help you improve it. We'll provide metadata that will provide more meaning and value to those services. And by aggregating this together, maybe they can build a really interesting company. I think data co-ops are easiest to manage when you have lots of little players. Then you have like 3 or 4 big ones where one can throw up its hands at any time and say, we're out, we give up on this, and then it's a lot less valuable. Yeah. Boy, it's a good question. It's one that I think about a lot. It's not easy. I think the world is changing very quickly, and I think there are 3 things that I do and that we do as a firm, and I think other firms do as well. There's nothing really proprietary in this. But one is staying in touch with the smartest technology thinkers in the field, who typically see changes in an academic area, like iterative learning, be really significant before hitting the actual product world, and can say, hey, in a couple of years, there are going to be a lot of robotics companies that should be able to develop very quickly because of these academic developments. And often it's their students who start the companies. So, there have been a variety of companies of those types that we and others have invested in. So that's one. 2 is to have some thesis, or it's really a set of theses around where the biggest opportunities are. And I love obscure industries, as probably was clear in the presentation. But go get to know all of the companies trying to do anything in those industries, the smartest customers in those industries. Ask the smartest agricultural customers, have you seen any new technology, image recognition products that can help you determine the health of your crops, the relative performance of your crops, and so on? And often they say, oh yeah, these 2 young guys from Carnegie Mellon came by last week and you should go talk to them. And then I think staying in the mix with a lot of the existing startups, because often the best entrepreneurs of the next startup comes out of one of the existing ones. And so seeing the world through a lens of who are the handful of extraordinary people in this field who could do something big. And maybe they need a helping hand, maybe they hadn't thought about it, maybe they're planning on it but need capital, but to try to be an enabler to them and a sounding board. Those are some of the ways, but I still haven't figured it out because I still miss important things that I wish I had seen. Yeah.
You mentioned improving the products. Can you think of some ways that people use their proprietary data set to move in sort of lateral directions? Like Tesla, the batteries, the self-driving cars. It's not necessarily core, but it's improving the user.
Yeah.
Things of that data realm.
That's one of the most intellectually interesting parts of this whole field, and I think you tend to see the examples for really large companies that have the budgets to focus on something non-core. So Google, I think, has done this more than anyone, trying to dominate these semantic services like image recognition, like translation. I think they would like to be the brain for a lot of the rest of the application world. And is that core to their business now? No, but is it a really interesting long-term plan? Absolutely. And having people play with cool apps that use their data, like just looking at a picture and being able to tell you that yeah, that's from Denmark, and it's probably from one of these two streets in Denmark. So I think Google and Facebook both, I think Facebook's doing interesting things they haven't announced as much, are doing a lot. Another angle on that question is the platform companies have created, specifically Facebook and Twitter and Uber, have created API programs to try to create an ecosystem of developers, which is a very smart thing for them to do. Sometimes tough as a developer when you create something cool and they put it in their roadmap and it wasn't that great being a partner. But that's how that's how Twitter indirectly discovered this new capability of real-time information discovery that Dataminr pulled off, because it was approved for partnership at the API program level, and then it started to do something really cool, and so it sort of grew in parallel to Twitter, and Twitter said, wow, that's great, let's work together more closely. But I'm always on the lookout for those, because I think we're going to see a lot more of them. And I think you'll see a lot from Google, Amazon, and Facebook in particular, where they're able to do things, and Facebook with all of its photos and photo recognition, visual intelligence, that are just stunningly valuable and interesting. And I think they're primarily focused on consumer applications, but my gosh, if they were to use their data for enterprise applications, my view of the world is that those companies, that there may be 8 organizations on the planet, maybe 10, that have so much data that they'll be capable of more and more orthogonal superpowers over time. And not only do they have so much data today, but they're optimizing ingestion, and they're just getting data every way they can. And there's so much option value in that data. So Google, a lot of people say, oh, search is in the 7th inning, and what else have they done significant lately? I think the sort of latent intelligence in all of their data and the caliber of the people they have to help bring it out is pretty extraordinary. There's a really magnificent article I'd recommend for everyone if you haven't seen it. It was the New York Times Magazine. It was about Google Translate. It's called The Great AI Awakening. But it gives you a sense of like right up close. It gives you the sort of theoretical view and then what it was like implementing it, of this team from Google Mind who approached the Google Translate team and said, we think we can use machine learning to improve your product. And inevitably, the Translate team said, my gosh, we've been doing this for a decade. We know it really well. This is kind of scary to mess up our product. And with a tiny fraction of engineers, they achieved a step function change and improvement that was 10x any other incremental change that Google had seen. And it was their first shot at it. It was just stunning, but it gives you a sense of what you can do with that much data and that much brain power. And I think China, the big players in China, Tencent and Baidu, Alibaba will be others who are very interesting companies to watch in this regard. But I think Google is, and Facebook I would say have the best talent that I'm aware of. Yeah.
So one new source of data with the cost of genetic sequencing dropping like a rock is there's tons of genomic data that's going to develop. Do you see any opportunities in that space, or what do you think of the whole genomic space?
I do. That's a really good point. And that's a sort of second order point about future data sets based on other trends, because I think you're right. I mean, the cost is dropping dramatically, and there's a lot more that we can see than traditional Illumina sequencing has allowed. As it happens, my wife has started one of those companies and it uses machine learning. It's a genome, so it's an example of many that we see, but it's a company that aggregates genomics data focused on fertility from academic sources, from IVF clinics. And so again, it was focused on an area that no one was focused on. I don't know, Google or Facebook engineers who left their companies and said, let's create a big data fertility company. It's not obvious. But they managed to get all this data, and now they can do really interesting things with it. And they're developing diagnostics to help women understand their personal fertility profiles and proclivity to certain fertility problems. And it's focused on helping people who are having problems get pregnant. But that's a cool area. So absolutely, I see a lot of opportunity there. And that's some of the richest data where I think machine learning will be very well suited for. All right, everything clear? All right, if you guys have any huge company opportunities, please let me know. Thank you very much.